Good morning. Our Old Testament lesson today from Genesis is the origin story for how Jacob's name gets changed to Israel. And so it's also the origin story for how the nation of Israel gets its name. I think to sort of understand the fullness of what's going on here, I just want to widen the aperture a little bit and let you in on what's been going on with Jacob. So Jacob is, in this morning's lesson, traveling. He is on his way to see his brother Esau. You might remember that Esau is his older brother, only by a few moments. They're twins. But Esau was birthed first, and so in a highly patriarchal culture, the firstborn son gets everything. And even if it's just by a few moments, Esau is to get everything. He's to get his father's blessing and everything that comes with it. And you might remember the sad, strange story of Jacob stealing his brother's birthright. Remember this? He goes to his father, Isaac. Isaac is basically on his deathbed. He is blind. And Jacob goes to his father and presents himself as Esau, even to go as far as Esau was apparently a hairy man. And so Jacob put on an animal fur over him. And so when Isaac took his hand, he felt like Esau. And so Isaac gives him his blessing, thinking it's Esau. Esau, at the end of the blessing, comes in and sees what's going on. It is totally heartbroken at what has happened. Esau is also a larger and stronger guy than Jacob, and so Jacob flees, scared for his life. When we meet Jacob in this lesson today, he is on his way to see his brother for the first time in perhaps 30 years. Long decades have gone by, and Jacob just imagines that his brother's anger and hatred towards him has just grown and grown and grown. And he's worried that Esau might want to kill him. That's what he's going to. Sounds great, right? You want to take that journey? Here's what he's leaving. He just left the place where he's been living for the last several decades, which is the household of Laban, who is his father-in-law. And you might remember the strange, sad tale of how Jacob falls in love with one of Laban's daughters. He falls in love with Rachel. He wants to marry Rachel. He goes to Laban and says, look, if I work for you for 7 years, can I marry your daughter? Laban says, fine. So he works for 7 years. And then there's a wedding night, and there's a wedding morning when the sun comes up, and the veil goes up over the face of the bride, and it's not Rachel. It's Leah. Laban has tricked Jacob, and he's married the wrong person. Of course, Jacob is distraught and angry and upset, and he brokers a deal with Laban that if he will work another 7 years, that he will also get to marry Rachel, and which he does. And then his family, Rachel and Leah, and then their two handmaids, they have all these issues and fights and strife between them. There's all kinds of tension between Jacob and Laban. You also might remember the strange tale about how Jacob basically cheats Laban out of a whole bunch of his wealth, which is tied up in flocks and herds. He basically takes far more than probably was due him. And so when he leaves, they leave under the cover of night, and there's all this stress. That's what he's leaving. So he's leaving this situation of great stress and turmoil, and he's heading to a situation of great stress and turmoil. He's just trading in one stress for another. And so here we find him today at the shores of the Jabbok River. And Jacob's the traveling party heading from point A to point B was quite large. You know, Jacob will eventually have 12 sons. I think at this point he only has 10, only 10. Some of those sons are married and have children of their own. So there's wives, then there's children, then there's their spouses, then there's the grandchildren, then there's all these thousands of flocks and herds, which then come with their own shepherds and hired hands. So it's this like huge caravan traveling across the land. Jacob gets all the wives, all the children, all the grandchildren, all the animals, all the hired hands across the river, and then Jacob stands on the other side by himself and waves. I only have one wife, and were I to do this, were I to send her across with all the people and problems and diapers and all of that, and I decided to stay on the other side and have a nice quiet night to myself, I know what Karen's face would look like. And so Jacob, I have to imagine, looks across this window, across the Jabbok River, and sees four faces staring at him. But, you know, he's going from stress to stress. And so can we blame the guy for having one peaceful night? One night by himself on the edge of this river. You ever sit by a river by yourself and you just hear it and it just lulls and it's just beautiful? He just lays down to go to bed, probably looking up at the stars, hearing the river. Maybe the first quiet night this poor guy has had in a long time. When along comes a stranger who jumps on top of him and starts wrestling him. And they wrestle all night long. Can you imagine? I still sometimes wrestle my kids, and after like 15 minutes, I'm done. Like, I need to go sit on the couch and then, do something else, because it's tiring. I love to wrestle my dog, but I got like 15 or 20 minutes in me, and then I need to sit down and do something else. Jacob at this point is not a spring chicken, but he wrestles this stranger all night long. And the longer they wrestle, there's something in Jacob that makes him think that this is not just any old stranger. That the stranger is someone more, something more. And so at the end of the night, as the sun is about ready to rise, Jacob asks the stranger to bless him. And the stranger blesses him with a new name, Israel, which means struggle with God, wrestle with God, strife with God. So who did Jacob wrestle? He's leaving one stressful situation to another, and all night long he struggles with God. There's struggle behind him, there's struggle before him, and there's struggle exactly where he's at. And his name becomes struggle. You might look at the story of Jacob and say, wow, he must not be very blessed. Right? Like if he was really faithful and really had done his stuff, then he would have the perfect life and everything would be fine. Because that's sometimes how we imagine the religious, faithful, spiritual life to be. If we just do all the stuff, we just, come to church and say our prayers and give and go to the food bank and et cetera, then our life will be great. But this is the patriarch of a nation who passes his name on to the followers of God ever after. We are the people who struggle and wrestle with God. Christians we sort of take that to the next level, maybe the next logical step. We take as our symbol the cross. Not a butterfly, not a sunbeam, but the very symbol of suffering and death. Because we are still the people who struggle with God. I read that struggling with God in two ways. One is we struggle with God. That our faith is hard. The spiritual life is hard. A relationship with God is hard. Lovely, beautiful, holy, wonderful. I highly recommend it. But it's hard. Because sometimes we have doubts. And sometimes we wonder. And sometimes you get a sense of spiritual dryness. You're like, I can't even do church today. Can't even do it. And that is okay. In fact, I'm more comfortable with someone who wrestles and struggles and wonders and questions than I am with people who are I just believe. I just take all my thoughts and all my questions and I just stuff them down under the rug and don't think about them at all. I just believe. No, wrestle. The story of the scriptures is people wrestling with God. Jacob, certainly. Moses, Miriam, David, Solomon, Peter, Paul, James, Mary Magdalene, Job, Habakkuk. People struggling, sometimes wondering where God is, sometimes wondering what God's up to, sometimes angry with God. If God gives Jacob the name struggle, do we think that God doesn't want us to struggle? Do we think that religion, our faith, Christianity is meant to just be all beauty, all wonder, all the time? No, we struggle with God. It's not just this precious thing. I also take it the other way, that we struggle with God. That when we are hurting, when we feel lost, when we are angry, when we are upset, when we feel like the whole bottom has fallen out on this thing that we call life, that we don't do it alone. That God comes alongside us as we struggle. We struggle with God. Jacob, whether he was aware of it or not, struggled with God. God was with him in Laban's household. God was going to be with him when he meets his brother Esau. God was with him on the side of the Jabbok River. He struggled and God was right there. And if I could just add one more thing, and I promise I'm landing the plane here, about struggling alongside of God. God comes to us and interacts with us in different ways. And, there have been times in my own life that I have struggled with my health. The last 8-10 years I've been in the hospital a couple times and had things going on, surgeries, and had to deal with my body failing me and all of that stuff that comes along with that. And there have been times where I felt, in the hospital bed or in my own bed, and I felt there have been times very close to God, like God is here, my heart is at peace, like God's close. But there are other times where it's not as that close feeling. Sometimes I wonder where God is too. And because sometimes God comes to us in our hearts, and sometimes God comes to us in the guise of other people. If you think about it, the story of the scriptures, the long story of God and us is not just God snapping his fingers and making things happen. It's God coming to people and saying, I want you to go for me and help me do this thing, right? He didn't just snap his fingers and Israel's freed from Egypt. He goes to Moses, and Moses, I want you to go for me. You can take your brother with you, and you guys, we're going to work together to make this thing happen. God always calls us alongside him to help others who are struggling. I know that the times where maybe it wasn't so fuzzy feelings in my heart, God came to me through you and the other people who love and care for me. And I know that some of you have told me that you have felt in times that you have struggled and been hurting and been sick, mourning, grieving, that God has come to you in your St. Mark's family and amongst the other people who love and care for you. And so if we're going to be the people who struggle with God, with our faith, and we're going to be the people who struggle alongside of God, we also have to be the people who are willing to go alongside others who are suffering and hurting. And whether that means just sending them a nice text, whether it means going over and giving them a hug, whether that means, driving them to the hospital, whether that means sitting down and allowing them to spill everything to you, God sends us to the people whose hearts are breaking so that we might join in this great thing that God does in coming alongside those who struggle. Because that is who we are. We are they who struggle and wrestle with God.